Cool.
Okay,
Right. Okay, so I will fire away if that's okay.
no problem.
Okay, so I'm here with Jemin Popat, who is a board member of Repair Cafe Wales and has kindly agreed to join us for a bit of time to talk about himself, his role, and the strategy of Repair Cafe Wales, or even the potential strategy of Repair Cafe Wales. So, Jemin, thank you for coming along.
Thanks for having me.
Now, could you give us a bit of information about your background, please?
Yeah, so I've been doing entrepreneurial type things since my teenage years. I'm 38 now. I started my current company about 19 years ago, doing online recruitment. When I first started, if you wanted a job, you advertised in the local newspaper, which seems quite surprising to many millennials now. But you didn't go online to buy a car, get a job, or buy a house. You bought the local newspaper. So we started a job site, first one for Wales, and we've evolved that in several different ways. It's led me off in different directions. I've actually worked in Asia, in Myanmar, with a head office in China. So I've done online recruitment and online businesses in Asia. Been a business mentor for Business Wales. I've had other little companies on the side, but online recruitment has always been my main venture, and different entrepreneurial projects along the way.
Thank you. And what brought you to Repair? How did you go from there? I realise you're still, obviously running the Welsh recruitment site, but what brought you to Repair Cafe Wales?
Yeah, it's just a good question. So I was in Myanmar from 2012 to 2015. If you don't know about Myanmar, it was a military dictatorship for many years. I went there when there was no internet, no cars, no bank accounts. It was like, it's crazy. I got a million stories about that. But when I did work there over 4 years, it was super intense. So I came back, started a property company alongside my recruitment business, and around about 2018, decided to have a break. And I started doing mentoring for Business Wales. And then I really enjoyed that, and I wanted to take that to the next level. I'd had experience at board level, more participating actually than being board director. And funnily enough, we'd seen Repair Cafe Wales advertising the role, and we actually called them to advertise on our website because we advertise jobs on the website. And when I was reviewing the jobs, I was like, oh, that sounds interesting. I think I could help with that. So it was as a result of a sales call from one of my guys presenting me with a job advert, and it was just a little bit of luck that it was at the right time for me, really.
Okay. So you weren't one of Keris's cohorts?
No.
Okay.
Well, in an ironic way, I don't know what the probability of this is, but my partner who moved from London, she actually replaced Keris in her recruitment job when she joined Repair Cafe Wales. So she Goodson Thomas and knew Phoebe and Keris, totally unrelated.
Wow.
So maybe it was destined for me to join the board.
That's interesting. I didn't know that. Okay. See, it's quite nice, these conversations, because we also find out things that, I find out things that I didn't know.
Yeah.
Okay. And so in terms of, you're quite unique both in Repair Cafe Wales and generally with the amount of entrepreneurial, firstly, experience, but secondly, vigor and energy that you bring. And I can attest to that, having seen you at work in the board.
It made me blush. Thank you.
So what would you, in terms of the before getting onto the strategy, in terms of the look and feel and potential of Repair Cafe Wales, what are your views of its strengths and weaknesses, I guess, in terms of in terms of an organization?
Yeah, so when I joined, I'd actually heard of Repair Cafe Wales because I'd seen, although I didn't know Keris at the time, I'd seen her on ITV of some news report.
Okay.
And I thought that's super interesting. And then what I thought when we'd started, then after I joined and now, have all been slightly different. So when I started, it felt like the organization was a little bit more grown up than it actually was, because the perception to the outside world is, and I've actually experienced this. I remember when I had my recruitment business, I was 22, 23, we'd won or nominated for lots of awards, and people had this perception with this huge glass office with hundreds of staff. And there was really three of us in a tiny little room, a little bit like I'm in now, with no windows. And there was a difference in perception, which is a good thing. And I felt a little bit with that with Repair Cafe. It felt like a very large brand, very established. But when I came in, it was a lot more bootstrap and a lot more energy and enthusiasm, but maybe not the governance or the structure that I would have thought might have been there. So that was my impression then. My feeling at the moment is the opportunity is great, but we're definitely in a kind of a growth phase. I think there's only so far you can go on energy and enthusiasm. Now I think what we've tried to do is bring in a number of board directors earlier in the year to try and give more support and go through this kind of growing pain stage. And I feel that's probably where we are at the moment.
Yeah, so I like the insight around sort of the image that you can project, and I guess you can do that a lot more convincingly on the internet now.
Yeah, absolutely.
Because people, if you go back 20 years, people would probably know where your office was and know you through people. Right? Whereas now, if you've got a good-looking brand and a good website and good social media.
You could be sitting at home in your pajamas selling, Gucci handbags and people and sliced bread. So perception and reality is somewhere different. But what I would say is what I was, from a strength and weaknesses point of view, although maybe some of the governance and structure and maybe those kind of stable things within an organization that's 10 or 15 years old weren't there. What you do have is a startup mentality. So there's a lot of energy, there's a lot of passion, there's a lot of, you can be entrepreneurial, and also from a if someone's watching this and you've got a route of career and you could go to a startup or you can go to a large corporate. There are pros and cons to both. I've always preferred the startup environment because it's harder, but it's more energetic, it's more passionate, less support, but you learn more and you learn quicker. And that's why this probably director role and board level role suited my skill set better.
Yep.
And potentially an organization that has a lot more resources, a lot more people, and is a lot more established. In that, you're a bit more of a cog. And I think my skill set is more towards the startup and growth phase to get
there. Yeah. I mean, I usually put myself in that bracket as well. So I know what you're talking about. I get bored quite easily when things are the same day to day.
I think, yeah, it's funny actually. We were talking about, like, if you look at my experience, I started my company, I said 19 odd years ago, but it's evolved 4 or 5 times during that period. So it's not been the same. In between, I've launched a couple of other companies and I've moved to Burma for 4 years. I've had a TV show and I've done different little bits along the way to keep that excitement. So that stable enterprise has gone through, but like you, I can't stand still. For me, that's going backwards. Things have to keep evolving and changing. So whereas maybe this now feels a bit same for you because it's a new challenge for me.
Yeah.
There's new energy that I can put through it, but maybe I'd be in the same position a couple of years down the line.
Yeah. No, I think that's a very good point. And also, there's I guess with a lot of entrepreneurs, there's almost, as you say, in 2018, you needed a break almost. You put a whole load of energy in at one stage, and it doesn't really matter what that stage is as long as it continues to grow. That's interesting. In terms of your own interests and activities in Repair Cafe Wales, what excites you and where do you see your focus being?
When I initially joined as a board director, I was quite open of what my role would be. I was very clear at the interview stage that I didn't fit into a box. I'm not the HR person, I'm not the legal person, I'm not the finance person. Being an entrepreneur in a startup environment, you wear all the different hats. And so I had a little bit of experience in all different areas. My main skill set is solving problems and trying to lead and motivate teams. But it became very quickly that there was a gap in revenue for the organization, and I've tried to mold my role around that. I was told at the beginning that it was impossible or very difficult for charities and our organizations to create revenue, and it is incredibly difficult. We've not cracked it, but we've had a lot of good ideas. We're having conversations with people like the British Heart Foundation, Pembrokeshire Council, and people to try and create that. So very much revenue generation was the goal. During COVID, this is a crazy year that nobody's had, so it's not normal playing field.
Yep.
So partnerships, normal meetings, trying new things is much more difficult. And there's been challenges for us around our volunteers being older, being more vulnerable, and lack of confidence wanting to do it. In recent times, the current chairman has decided to step back. So I've been asked to be co-chair with my colleague. So my role again is probably going to change. I'm still always going to have that interest in the income generation, entrepreneurial side, but now I have to have an eye on government strategy, bringing the team together, and that's already kind of happening. Trying to identify some things that are missing between board level and maybe the management team. So my role, a little bit like my career, is still kind of within Repair Cafe, but it's already developed 2 or 3 times within a year.
Yep. Okay. And in terms of, I know we have, we've spent a bit of time developing a formal strategy document, but as you and I both know, what you have in the formal strategy document and what you really do in practice are very often different things. In terms of the strategy of Repair Cafe, in terms of where it might go, I guess, a lot of this is unpredictable, but where it might go and where it should go in the next 5 years, say, what are your views on that?
Making a note for I forget my questions halfway through my answers.
Sure, yeah.
I think I had a different idea 6 months ago and I have a different idea now. So after about a month or 2 of joining the board, I was very focused on revenue generation, about partnerships. I felt that what we did was repair things that people want, but there were 2 big gaps that we didn't have, which was repairing things people don't want. So if you have a toaster, you're quite happy to buy a new one for Tesco for 10 quid, but you don't want to chuck the other one away. We could repair that and use that in a particular purpose, but also upcycling old items into new items, whether they could be building materials into art or whether it be chairs into benches for the garden. So there were 3 areas and I felt 2 of them where we weren't hitting. What I realized probably over the summer is that my ambitions and the resources we have, both from a time perspective and a people on the ground perspective, they're probably a mismatch. So I had to scale back in the short term. In the long term, I still think those are 2 key areas. So for me, we had a great board meeting in September where the current chair said we should open a repair cafe in every town, city and suburb in Wales. As new board directors, we probably hadn't had that communicated to us. And we all love that and we've all gravitated around that. So I've kind of scaled back my private income aspirations in the short term to focus on building the foundation so that we can do that, building a repair cafe in every town, city and suburb in Wales. Over the 5 years, I would see it as probably the next 6 months or so is we need a little different skill set at board level. We need a little bit more in the management team. We've got 3 full-time, we've got 3 paid employees part-time. They need a bit more support. And I think once we've got that, we've also got a lot of support from Welsh Government. Once that is rolling and clicking in the way we want, then I would think we'd go back to the income generation in the 2 other pots that I mentioned. Yep. So that's broadly what I'm thinking at the moment.
Okay, thank you. That's that's interesting. One thing that came to mind when you were talking is how difficult strategy is in the third sector. You and I both have experience and, to some extent still work in the private sector. And in private sector strategy is in terms of the long-term aim, it's relatively simple in terms of maximizing your profits. And you might do that in different ways in a specific area. And your capacity to achieve that is relatively based upon the resources you have, and roughly what those resources are. In the third sector, I guess there's 2 things. One is that it is the resources that you have are fickle in terms of you might get a grant of $250,000, you might not. If you get the grant of $250,000, it transforms completely your ambitions and your capacity to achieve your strategy. And the second thing is, because you're not seeking to maximize revenue, strategy in some ways is a bit, in my view, it's a bit more difficult in terms of, there's a lot of good out there we could do. And, we've talked about, we've obviously got the repair thing. You talked about the upcycling thing. Someone else has talked about, going into schools. And so I guess, how do you, firstly, would you agree in terms of it being more complex in the third sector, in terms of your reflections on that? And also, how do you put a limit on those ambitions? Is it a matter of just prioritizing, or is it how do you go about thinking about that problem, I guess?
Yeah, I completely agree. It's definitely a difficult and different challenge that I'm used to in the private sector. What is a win is a different answer as well in this sector than, and actually, although I mentioned 2 other pots, there's probably about 12 things from training, schools, all the kind of other stuff that's there as well of how you do it. And we're having that conversation right now as a board to say, actually, well, what's happened is, I described it that Joe and Keris are co-founders of Repair Cafe Wales, and they've been knocking on doors, and every door has been closed, 100 doors on the street, all closed. And then one creaks open and we're all happy, and now we've got doors opening left, right, and centre, and it's very difficult for us not to go inside because we've been knocking on doors that don't for so long. But we've got to say no to stuff, and we're finding the resources on the ground. The management team is struggling because as our profile has increased, our resources haven't, and there's only so much that we can do. And we're having that conversation now, and there is so many different areas. It was a little bit like when I was in Burma, because they'd had no internet, no investment, nothing for so long. There were so many opportunities. It was like every major business you could think of, from shampoo to cars to mobile phones to every type of website. They didn't have any of it. So you wanted to do everything, and you wanted to do it 100 miles an hour. Couldn't. Everybody tried, and it wasn't that easy. So I think what I'm trying to do with board level is, yes, we maintain our profile Welsh Government, but if we don't have a strong foundation, nothing else will be achieved. So we have to scale back some of our ambitions, whether it's around schools, whether it's about art projects, whether it's about partnerships, and go back to that core foundation of getting a repair cafe in every town, city, and suburb. And when we have new opportunities, we have to look at it and go, does that help our core ambition? Because if we don't have that stability, nothing else will be able to grow. So for at least in the short to medium term, it's about trying to keep the board focused on that one item, as opposed to being distracted by all the bright lights around us.
Yeah. It's quite difficult for someone that has an entrepreneurial heart as well to do that, isn't it?
It is, and like you said, there can be real big game changers out of nowhere. You could apply for a fund of money of £250,000, and tomorrow that everything has changed. You've gone from 3 part-time staff to 15 full-time staff. Even in your ambitions in the private sector, it doesn't work like that. You don't have such surprises. I think you've got added challenges in this, that most of the board directors until recently haven't met. It was all virtual.
Yeah.
And so you're trying to lead and motivate a team that you actually don't really know in person. And the other thing is that Welsh Assembly's attitude towards finance for community-raised projects has also changed. We've heard that Welsh Government and government at the highest level have seen that we're interested in our community like we never have been before. Local parks, local environment, caring about our neighbours. And there's a lot more resources coming down the line to support that, but we don't necessarily know what that looks like. So I'd say as an entrepreneur, it's super exciting, but I'm using the skill set of trying to stay focused on the one or 2 things that I can do and not be distracted, which is similar but different.
Yeah, that's a good point. It reminds me of a lot of social media marketing advice, which is even if there's opportunities out there, you do one thing well. So you do LinkedIn well, or you do YouTube well, or you do a blog well, or whatever. If you're an entrepreneur and you try and do everything, you're going to spread yourself too thin, and you're probably going to fail at everything, because there's a path dependency, I think they'd call it. If your returns won't come in a month, they might come in 2 years of you plodding down that same path.
Yeah, and we've got also volunteer board directors. Most of the people in the organization are volunteers, and that has its own challenge.
Yeah.
If you're working with people day in, day out, you get a feel from them on a kind of minute by minute, hour by hour level. Are they engaged? Is it exciting? What bits of the work they like? What bits you don't like? But if you're having a board meeting once a month for an hour or two with someone you've never met, only had screen time with, it's hard to know their motivation, their commitment, their level. And that adds, all of these are challenges we don't experience necessarily in a normal environment in the private sector. These are all challenges for this year in this sector. So it's definitely a unique time.
It is, yes, yeah. I've got one final question, which is connecting up your early focus certainly on revenue generation. So how do we bring money in that isn't dependent on grants, with this idea of having more capacity in the management team. And one of the challenges I think the organization might have is, because we are so dependent on grants, and we've got 3 very good motivated employees, and then we've got this wider voluntary senior team. What you don't want to happen is in 6 months is that you've got to sack 2 of those employees, and then perhaps we land a £500,000 grant, and then for a couple of years you employed 10 employees, and then that disappears and you're down to no employees for a while, and that I see as quite destabilizing for the organization. And it would be, I guess I guess in terms of the must have, should have, could have, or would like to have, revenue generation is not necessarily a must have at the moment, but perhaps further down the line, when the funding isn't there, or the funding dries up, maybe it becomes a must have. I don't know. I mean, what are your thoughts around that?
Yeah, I totally agree. For us, we lurch from one quarter to the next, project by project. We spend our time scrambling for funding, as so many charitable, not-for-profit organizations do. We could focus and do so much good work if we knew that funds was coming in. But one of the people who works with us spends 70 or 80% of their time chasing funding almost for her own job and a few core activities. So we're having that conversation now of how do we get core funding. We have an excellent relationship with Welsh Government. Is there a different way? Should we be a different structure? Do we need to have a different way of thinking about how we fund the organisation? I think from a revenue generation point, I do think we had stable income. Like, we've spoken to a few different organisations over the last 6 months. We spoke to a business called Cracked It in London, and what they do is they fix mobile phones and they use ex-offenders to do it. Pre-COVID, they would go to big high-rise financial buildings in Canary Wharf, and now they were doing a more remote service, and they had their own income. They didn't have to rely on anybody else. They did it at the beginning. We've spoken to other organisations that have had similar things. There's one up in Scotland who is similar to us, but then now they do repairing of computer equipment with social enterprises, and then they're not relying on anyone. And another one we've got in West Wales, where somebody's done a remakery of people who have learning difficulties, and they're not, they do get some grants, but not a huge amount. So I'd say in the long term, we absolutely want our own revenue stream to have our own control. But I do think there's a gap between where we are to get to that stage. And we a little bit, we depend on those grants in the short to medium term. And I don't see that as an immediate change unless we became a really kind of commercial enterprise. So when I spoke to the board and the co-chairs, the co-founders, we don't necessarily want to become just fixing mobile phones, or we don't necessarily want to just do computer equipment. We're trying to actually build community relations in Wales. And those two things don't necessarily go together. If I was talking just about revenue, we'd have a much different strategy. The core of our organization is kind of stopping waste to landfill and bringing communities together. And those don't necessarily go with revenue. So I don't judge our success by the revenue number, but the revenue number influences how successful we can be.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, no, that's a really nice way of putting it. there's definitely, I mean, I've been in a business school for 15 years now, and I'm being schooled on strategy by this tiny organization, which is interesting. I said that was the last question. It's actually prompted another thought. Your answers prompted another thought, and that's around partnerships, I guess, in terms of that. There's, as you say, there's other organizations that are doing similar things in different ways. You know, some of them might have a remakery where they're fixing things in a company. Some of them might be making money from mobile phone repairs. Some of them might be engaging more with training of ex-offenders or whatever. How do you, again, in the private sector, with a merger and acquisition, you look for companies that are aligned, that will allow you to have a synergy that creates more value, and then you can roughly predict that value, work out what you're going to pay for them, and then give them an offer. In the third sector, that's a lot more tricky because, you know, Benthig is an example of an organization that, you know, we're well aligned with. I guess, what are your thoughts in terms of, you know, these organizations joining together? You know, these would that create too much of a beast in terms of, you know, it, you know, if the cash flow fails, then, you know, they all disappear, or do you think there's potential there in terms of, you know, not taking over, but merging with other like-minded third sector companies?
It's another great question, and it's something we've probably been talking about on and off for 6 months. We mentioned Benthig. People aren't aware of them. They're a library of things. So, you know, instead of everyone having a lawnmower on a street, you can have one and people share it and rent it out like you rent books. And I'm back and forth on this. I don't think there's a clear answer yet. I would say in theory, what you'd have is you would marry up with the 2 or 3 organizations similar to you and go at it together, share the resources. But the difficulty is finding who is exact. In the third sector, everybody's super friendly. Everybody wants to help each other. You have conversations, but everything's really slow as well compared to the private sector. You make a decision in the morning and it's done.
Yeah.
Where there's a whole new time scale in this industry. And that was one of my things of like, why haven't we done it yet? And it was like, well, it's only been 2 days. And I'm like, sure. So you have to, when you go from the private to the anything related to government or not-for-profit, there's a different time element. We almost have too many people wanting to partner with us and almost too many organizations that we think are super interesting. And the challenge is not necessarily merging with another organization. The challenge is kind of finding the time of knowing who to do that's not talking for the sake of it. Because every conversation looks interesting and every organization has potential, and there's thousands of them. So, and that's one of the things we're finding is a challenge of, sometimes it can be like noise. For example, you go on LinkedIn and there are interesting articles about lots of different topics, but you could spend your whole day reading all these interesting articles and not actually get anything done. And you can get sucked into this kind of partnership, have a chat, share knowledge. All this is super important, but it's discipline of knowing which conversations. And at the moment, I have no definitive answer what the right algorithm for that is. For Repair Cafe Wales, in my mind, I do think partnerships are important. I think we have a really good relationship with Benthig. I think there'll be 1 or 2 more along the way, but I think the key is to be disciplined. How much resource we put into it and putting our own ducks in order first. I think if we get the foundation right, if we build up our capacity to open repair cafes in every town, city and suburb in Wales, we will be in a much better place to help others and partner with others. So without a strong foundation, the revenue generation doesn't work, the partnerships don't work, the governance doesn't work, and the organization doesn't work. So we have to focus on our own cake. After that, the icing and the cherry and all that will come later.
That's a really, I like the metaphor. Yeah. In the private sector, there's a book called Profit First, by Michael Mikhailovich or something like that. And he, you know, he gets frustrated because everyone has these meetings about their marketing strategy, and then they'll do some research, and then there'll be a planning session. And he's like, where's your money? Are you selling stuff to clients? You know, forget about everything else. And I suppose what you're saying is that there's a third sector equivalent of that, in that, you know, don't get distracted from your core aim.
Yeah, and I think, like for me, I'm not setting myself targets of revenue, but I'm setting myself in my mind targets of how many repair cafes have we opened, how many communities have we helped. And if we've got to beg, borrow and steal funding in the short term, and if we've got to put some revenue generation in the private sector on hold in the short term, as long as that number is increasing, as long as we are impacting communities, that is our, if we're looking at a P&L, that's our turnover.
Yeah.
The number of, and you know, we want to go from dozens to hundreds. And that, if we stay focused on that, if we achieve nothing else, we'll have made a big impact.
Yeah.
And that's what kind of we're all here to do.
Yeah. That's a really good point. And I also guess in terms of signaling our capacity and our strength and our voice, you know, to funders and to the Welsh Government and to important stakeholders, the more of these that we have, the more that we can say, you know, we've got all of these behind us. It's not just us standing here talking. We represent, you know, 100 repair cafes and perhaps, you know, 10,000 volunteers or whatever.
Exactly. And I think, you know, people have heard of British Heart Foundation, people have heard of Cancer Research UK, the Oxford, whatever it might be. These are large organizations with a lot of people they represent. If we have 5 repair cafes in Wales, we have a squeak of a voice. If we represent every repair cafe community in towns and cities in Wales, say we had 250, 200 of these, then our voice carries more weight. We can partner at a higher level. We can have private organizations giving us more resources, and we can represent all those people. It's basically like buying in bulk or scale or whatever technology you want to use. If we grow and have a footprint and represent all of Wales, because one of our challenges as part of the strategy is, at the moment, a lot of the board members and resources are South Wales focused, and this is a problem in many organizations in Wales, where there's a split between North and South. Because of the geography, it's almost like 2 different countries in some ways. You got a big gap in the middle. You got West Wales. Like I'm Welsh, born and bred, although my accent doesn't sound like it, and no one ever thinks I'm Welsh. Must be the Indian and the beard, I think. But not enough of the board members speak Welsh. We're not representing enough of Wales, and that's another one of our key challenges about governance and diversity. I do think we have a very diverse board between men and women, different ethnic backgrounds, different cultural backgrounds, but maybe we need a bit more of a geographical diversity.
Yeah.
And that's one of the things that we need to work for going forward.
Okay, brilliant. Jemin, thank you so much for your insights. It's been a real pleasure, and I'm hoping that people will find this very useful. Thank you.
Thank you.
Take care.